Mac Henderson's hiking boot froze mid-step on the forest trail, his weathered hand gripping the walking stick as an agonized whimpering pierced the Montana morning silence. The sound wasn't human. It was something far more desperate. Through the pine branches ahead, coils of massive brown and yellow scales writhed around gray fur, and three wolf pups circled frantically, their high-pitched cries echoing off the valley walls. A 14-foot Burmese python had wrapped itself around a mother wolf's hindquarters, its grip tightening with each labored breath she took. Mac's coffee thermos slipped from his trembling fingers, crashing against the rocks below. At 58, he'd seen plenty of wildlife encounters, but this defied everything he knew about Montana's ecosystem. Pythons didn't belong here. The wolf's golden eyes found his through the undergrowth, and in them he saw not wild fear, but a desperate plea that cut straight through his chest. Her pups would die without her. "Jesus Christ," Mac whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized the impossible choice before him: save her or watch a family die. But how do you fight a monster with nothing but your bare hands? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Marcus Mac Henderson had never imagined that retirement would feel like a slow death. 18 months had crawled by since Ellen's funeral, each morning stretching endlessly in the silence of his cabin on the edge of Glacier National Park. The coffee still tasted like sawdust, the bed still felt too big, and the photographs on the mantelpiece still made his chest tighten with a grief that refused to soften. At 58, Mac carried himself like a man who'd spent 30 years working cattle ranches across Montana, his shoulders broad but slightly stooped now, weathered hands that had delivered calves and mended fences now trembling slightly when he thought no one was looking. Ellen used to say his green eyes could gentle a spooked horse, but these days they mostly reflected the emptiness he felt rattling around inside his ribcage. The morning walks had become his lifeline, the only thing that pulled him from the suffocating quiet of the cabin where Ellen's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table, where her coffee mug remained unwashed in the sink. The Whitefish Trail wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, offering glimpses of peaks that Ellen had painted in watercolors during her final spring. She'd been gone before the aspens turned gold. Mac's closest neighbor, Margaret Maggie Sullivan, lived a quarter-mile down the gravel road in a modest blue house that her late husband Robert had built board by board. At 62, Maggie possessed the kind of steady competence that came from 40 years of nursing, her silver hair always neatly braided, her brown eyes sharp with the intelligence of someone who'd seen humanity at its most vulnerable. She'd lost Robert to a heart attack 2 years ago, and the shared understanding of sudden loss had drawn them into a careful friendship built on morning coffee and unspoken loneliness. "You can't keep walking yourself into exhaustion, Mac," she'd told him just yesterday, refilling his mug with coffee that actually tasted like something. "Ellen wouldn't want you disappearing into those mountains." But the mountains were the only place Mac felt close to breathing normally. Ellen had loved them, had made him promise to scatter her ashes from the summit of Bear Peak when the time came. He hadn't been able to do it yet, couldn't bring himself to let go of that final connection. The region around Flathead Valley had always been unforgiving territory, where harsh winters could trap families for months, and where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred depending on how far you drove from town. Ranchers like Derek Whitmore struggled to make ends meet, their livelihoods constantly threatened by everything from market prices to predators to weather that could destroy a year's work in a single storm. Mac had known this land his entire adult life, had worked these same valleys and ridges, had learned to read the sky and the seasons and the subtle signs that meant the difference between safety and disaster. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to encounter on this particular morning, when his routine walk would collide with something that would shatter his understanding of mercy, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways that broken hearts could still choose to love. The distress calls had been echoing through the forest for nearly 10 minutes before Mac finally located their source, his heart pounding as he pushed through a tangle of serviceberry bushes and emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive fallen Douglas fir. What he saw there would replay in his nightmares for months to come. The Burmese python was enormous, easily 14 feet of muscle and predatory intent, its brown and yellow diamond pattern gleaming in the dappled morning light. It had coiled around the hindquarters and lower back of a gray wolf, each ring of its body contracting with methodical precision. The wolf was a female, Mac could see immediately, her teats swollen with milk, which meant somewhere nearby there were pups depending on her return. 3 young wolves, perhaps 4 months old, circled the terrible scene with frantic energy. They were too small to pose any real threat to the python, but their loyalty to their mother kept them close, their high-pitched whines cutting through the forest silence like broken glass. One of the pups, a smaller female with distinctive white markings on her chest, kept darting forward as if to bite the python, only to retreat when the massive snake shifted its position. The mother wolf's golden eyes found Mac through the chaos, and what he saw there stopped his breath entirely. It wasn't the wild panic he expected from a trapped animal, but something far more complex, a desperate intelligence that seemed to recognize him as her only hope. Her breathing was labored, each exhale creating small puffs of vapor in the cool mountain air, and Mac could see that the python's grip was slowly, inexorably crushing the life from her body. "Easy, girl," Mac whispered, his voice barely audible as he assessed the situation. The python's head was positioned about 6 feet from where he stood, its cold black eyes fixed on him with reptilian indifference. Mac had dealt with rattlesnakes during his ranching years, but nothing had prepared him for this, a tropical predator that had no business existing in the mountains of Montana. Moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent decades around unpredictable animals, Mac reached for a sturdy branch that had broken off the fallen tree. It was about 4 feet long and thick as his wrist, not much of a weapon against 14 feet of pure muscle, but it would have to do. The key, he knew from his limited experience with constrictors, was not to try to unwrap the coils by force, but to convince the snake that this particular prey wasn't worth the effort. The wolf mother seemed to understand that Mac was trying to help. Rather than struggling against the python's grip, which would only cause the coils to tighten further, she remained perfectly still, conserving her strength and allowing Mac to approach without triggering additional defensive responses from either predator or snake. Mac positioned himself near the python's head and began applying steady pressure with the branch just behind the snake's skull, not trying to injure the creature but making it uncomfortable enough to consider releasing its hold. The python's mouth opened, revealing curved fangs designed for gripping prey, and its head swiveled toward Mac with alarming speed. For a terrifying moment, Mac thought the snake might abandon the wolf in favor of attacking him directly. "Come on," Mac murmured, maintaining pressure while every instinct screamed at him to run. "Find something easier." The standoff felt like it lasted hours, though Mac's watch would later tell him it was less than 10 minutes. The 3 wolf pups continued their anxious circling, occasionally breaking into mournful howls that seemed to carry across the entire valley. The mother wolf's breathing grew more shallow with each passing moment, and Mac could see her strength beginning to fail. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, Mac felt the python's resistance beginning to waver. The coils around the wolf's body loosened slightly, not enough to free her completely, but enough to allow her to draw a deeper breath. The python's head turned away from Mac, as if the creature was reassessing the situation and finding the mathematics of the encounter no longer in its favor. With what seemed like reptilian resignation, the massive snake began to unwind itself from around the wolf's body. The process was agonizingly slow, each coil releasing with deliberate reluctance, but finally the wolf was free. She struggled to her feet, favoring her right hind leg where the python's grip had been tightest, and turned to look directly at Mac. What happened next would remain burned into Mac's memory forever. The wolf dipped her head once, unmistakably, a nod of acknowledgement that seemed to bridge the vast gulf between their species. Then, moving with surprising grace despite her injuries, she limped toward the tree line where her pups waited. But just before disappearing into the shadows of the forest, she turned back one final time, her golden eyes holding Mac's gaze for a long, profound moment that felt like a promise or, perhaps, a blessing. The python, meanwhile, had slithered away into the underbrush, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. Mac stood alone in the clearing, his hands shaking from adrenaline and something deeper, a sense that he had just participated in something far more significant than a simple wildlife rescue. Mac couldn't shake the image of those golden eyes as he made his way back to the cabin, his hands still trembling from the encounter. Something about the wolf's gaze had felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. By the time he reached his front porch, the rational part of his mind was already trying to dismiss what had happened as a fluke, an escaped exotic pet, perhaps, or some kind of illegal release by irresponsible owners. But the next morning found him retracing his steps to the clearing, carrying a thermos of water and a small first aid kit that Ellen had insisted they keep for hiking emergencies. He told himself he was just checking to make sure the wolf hadn't suffered any serious injuries, but the truth was more complicated. For the first time since Ellen's death, he felt genuinely needed by something other than his own grief. The wolf was there, lying in the shade of the fallen tree with her 3 pups nursing contentedly. When she saw Mac approach, she lifted her head but didn't flee, an unprecedented display of trust that made his chest tighten with emotion. Her right hind leg showed obvious signs of bruising and swelling where the python had constricted, but she was moving well enough to care for her young. Mac set the water bowl at a respectful distance and retreated to watch. The wolf mother studied him for several long minutes before approaching the bowl, her movements careful and deliberate. As she drank, Mac noticed details he'd missed during the chaos of the rescue, the distinctive white patch on her chest, the intelligent set of her ears, the way she positioned herself to keep both Mac and her pups in view simultaneously. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" Mac murmured, and the wolf's ears swiveled toward his voice without alarm. When Mac shared the encounter with Maggie over coffee that afternoon, her nursing instincts immediately kicked in. "Burmese pythons in Montana?" she asked, setting down her mug with a sharp clink. "Mac, that doesn't make sense. Those snakes are tropical. They shouldn't be able to survive a Montana winter." That observation led them to Mac's laptop, where a quick internet search confirmed Maggie's suspicions. Burmese pythons were native to Southeast Asia and had become an invasive species in Florida's Everglades, but there were no recorded populations in the northern Rocky Mountains. The presence of such a large specimen in Glacier National Park was not just unusual, it was virtually impossible under natural circumstances. "Someone put that snake there," Maggie concluded, her brown eyes sharp with the kind of analytical thinking that had made her an excellent trauma nurse. The question is why. Mac contacted Montana Fish and Wildlife Service the next day, reaching Officer Sarah Crow Feather, a young biologist whose grandmother had been full-blood Blackfeet and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local ecosystems. Sarah listened to Mac's account with growing concern, asking detailed questions about the python's size, condition, and behavior. "I'll drive out tomorrow morning," Sarah promised. "If there's one exotic snake in the park, there could be others. This is a serious ecological threat." True to her word, Sarah arrived at Mac's cabin before dawn, accompanied by Dr. James Morton, a herpetologist from the University of Montana. Together, the three of them hiked to the clearing where Mac had encountered the python. The wolf family was nowhere to be seen, but Sarah's trained eye immediately spotted something Mac had missed. "Over here!" she called, kneeling beside a cluster of aspen trees about 50 yards from the fallen log. Partially hidden beneath a pile of fallen branches was a wooden crate, roughly 4 feet long and 18 inches wide, with air holes drilled along the sides and heavy-duty latches that had been left open. Dr. Morton examined the crate with obvious excitement. "This is a professional-grade snake transport container," he announced. "Expensive, too. Whoever released that python invested serious money in this operation." Sarah was already photographing the scene with her phone, her expression grim. This wasn't some kid letting loose a pet that got too big. This was deliberate placement. They spent the next 2 hours scouring the area for additional clues. Sarah found tire tracks on an old logging road that wound through the forest about a quarter-mile from the clearing, tracks that were fresh enough to have been made within the past week. Dr. Morton collected soil samples and took detailed measurements of the transport crate, while Mac found himself scanning the tree line for any sign of the wolf family. It was Sarah who made the connection that would crack the case wide open. During their hike back to the vehicles, she stopped abruptly and pulled out her phone. "I just remembered something," she said, scrolling through her photo gallery. "Last week I was checking trail cameras near Hungry Horse Reservoir, and one of them caught something odd." The photograph showed a pickup truck parked beside the Forest Service road, its tailgate down and a large wooden crate visible in the truck bed. The timestamp indicated the photo had been taken 3 days before Mac's encounter with the python. But what made Sarah's pulse quicken was the license plate, clearly visible and easily traceable. "Derek Whitmore," she read from her wildlife database, where the truck's registration had been cross-referenced with hunting and fishing licenses. "Local rancher, clean record except for—" She paused, scrolling through additional information. "Except for multiple complaints about wolf depredation on his property over the past 3 years. Mac felt his stomach drop. He knew Derek Whitmore by reputation, a third-generation rancher whose family had worked the same land for nearly a century. Derek's sheep operation had been devastated by wolf attacks 3 years ago, resulting in significant financial losses and ultimately contributing to the failure of his marriage. Mac remembered hearing through the local grapevine that Derek's wife had taken their children and moved back to her family in Billings, unable to cope with the mounting debts and Derek's increasingly bitter obsession with the wolves that had destroyed their livelihood. "So Derek decided to take matters into his own hands," Dr. Morton concluded grimly. "Release exotic predators to eliminate the local wolf population." But as they drove back toward town, Mac found himself thinking not about Derek's motivations, but about the wolf mother's golden eyes and the trust she had shown him. Somewhere in the forest behind them, she was caring for her 3 pups, unaware that she had become the target of a vendetta that stretched back years. The python had been just the beginning. If Derek was willing to import one exotic predator, he might have others waiting. The thought of that intelligent, trusting wolf falling victim to Derek's revenge plot filled Mac with a protective fury he hadn't felt since Ellen's diagnosis. Whatever Derek Whitmore was planning, Mac was determined to stop it. The confrontation with Derek Whitmore happened on a gray Thursday morning that promised rain. Mac had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the knowledge that the wolf he'd saved was likely the target of a deliberate campaign of revenge. When Sarah Crow Feather called to inform him that Derek had purchased not 1 but 3 Burmese pythons from a reptile dealer in Tampa, Florida, Mac knew he couldn't wait for official channels to resolve the situation. Derek's property sat in a valley 15 miles southeast of Mac's cabin, a sprawling ranch that had once supported 300 head of sheep and a modest but comfortable living for his family. Now, as Mac's pickup truck crunched up the gravel driveway, He could see the signs of economic collapse everywhere. Broken fence posts that hadn't been repaired, a barn with a sagging roof, and weeds growing through what had once been well-maintained corrals. The house itself told an even more heartbreaking story. Paint peeled from the siding in long, weathered strips, and several windows had been boarded up rather than replaced. A child's bicycle lay rusted beside the front steps, and a swing set in the backyard stood empty, its chains moving listlessly in the morning breeze. This had been a family home once, filled with the laughter of children and the comfortable rhythms of ranch life. Now it felt like a monument to loss. Derek answered Mac's knock on the front door with obvious suspicion, his hazel eyes narrowing as he recognized his visitor. At 48, Derek had the lean, wiry build of a man who'd spent his life working with livestock, but there was a hollowness to his cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals and too much stress. His brown hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples, and his hands showed the calluses and scars of someone who still worked hard despite having little to show for it. "Mac Henderson," Derek said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "What brings you out to my place?" "I think you know," Mac replied quietly. "Can we talk?" Derek stepped back reluctantly, allowing Mac into a living room that had clearly once been the heart of a happy home. Family photographs still lined the mantelpiece, showing Derek with a pretty blonde woman and 2 young children, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old. But dust covered the picture frames, and the furniture bore the unmistakable signs of a space that was no longer truly lived in. "Coffee?" Derek offered, more from ingrained ranch hospitality than genuine welcome. "That'd be good," Mac accepted, following Derek into a kitchen where dirty dishes sat piled in the sink and empty beer bottles lined the counter. Through the window, Mac could see the remnants of what had once been Susan Whitmore's garden, now overgrown with weeds and volunteer aspens. Derek poured coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting on the burner for hours, the brew bitter and thick as tar. He sat across from Mac at a kitchen table scarred with years of family meals, his hands wrapped around his mug as if seeking warmth from the ceramic. "You hear about the snakes?" Derek asked finally, his voice carrying a challenge that didn't quite mask the underlying exhaustion. "I'm here about a lot of things," Mac said carefully. "But yeah, the snakes are part of it." Derek laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Fish and wildlife send you to talk me down? Make me see the error of my ways?" "Nobody sent me, Derek. I came because I remember what happened to your sheep, and I understand why you're angry." "Do you?" Derek's voice rose slightly, and Mac could see 3 years of suppressed rage beginning to surface. "Do you understand what it's like to lose everything because the state protects wolves more than it protects people? Do you understand what it's like to watch your kids cry when you tell them they can't have new school clothes because the wolves killed 50 of our breeding ewes in one night?" Mac set down his coffee mug, the ceramic clicking against the worn wooden table. "I understand more than you might think." "Bullshit," Derek spat. "You're retired, Mac. You got your government pension and your paid-off cabin and all the time in the world to play wildlife rescuer. You don't know what it's like to watch your wife pack up your children and leave because you can't provide for them anymore." The pain in Derek's voice was raw and immediate, and Mac could see that the man sitting across from him was drowning in a grief that had nowhere to go except toward rage. The kitchen around them felt haunted by the ghost of family dinners and birthday celebrations, homework sessions and bedtime stories that would never happen again. "You're right," Mac said quietly. "I don't know what that's like. But I do know what it's like to lose the most important thing in your life and feel like there's nothing you can do about it." Derek's laugh was bitter. "Your wife died of cancer, Mac. That's tragic, but it's not the same thing. My family left because I failed them, because I couldn't protect what was mine. The wolves didn't set out to destroy your life, Derek. Didn't they? Derek stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he stared out at the empty corrals. You know what I found that morning? 50 dead sheep, throats torn out, bodies scattered across 3 acres like some kind of slaughterhouse. The wolves didn't even eat most of them. They just killed for the joy of killing. Mac had heard this story before, had seen the photographs that Derek had shown to anyone who would listen in the months following the attack. It had been a devastating loss, the kind of predation event that could destroy a small operation like Derek's overnight. But something in Derek's description didn't align with Mac's knowledge of wolf behavior. Wolves don't kill for joy, Derek. They kill to feed their families, just like you work to feed yours. Spare me the nature documentary bullshit, Derek snapped, turning back to face Mac. I know what I saw. What did the state investigation conclude? Derek's face darkened. State investigation was a joke. They sent some college kid out here who spent 2 hours looking around and declared it a typical predation event. Gave me a form to fill out for compensation that might pay for maybe 10% of what I lost. Mac leaned forward in his chair. Derek, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. How many more snakes do you have? Derek was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 2. Where are they? Safe. Waiting for the right opportunity. The right opportunity to do what? Kill more innocent animals? Derek whirled around, his face flushed with anger. Innocent? Those wolves destroyed everything I worked my whole life to build. They killed my sheep, they drove away my family, they turned me into a failure and a laughingstock in my own community. And killing them will bring Susan and the kids back? The question hung in the air between them like a physical blow. Derek's shoulders sagged, and for a moment Mac saw past the anger to the broken man underneath. A father and husband who had lost everything that gave his life meaning and was desperately searching for someone to blame. No, Derek admitted finally. But it might make me feel like I did something other than just roll over and let them destroy me. Mac stood slowly, moving to the window where Derek had been staring out at his empty ranch. In the distance, he could see the ridgeline where he'd encountered the wolf family, where even now the mother was probably teaching her pups to hunt, to survive, to protect each other in a world that offered few guarantees of safety. I killed a wolf once, Mac said quietly. Derek turned to stare at him, surprise replacing anger on his weathered face. 3 years ago, a big male, silver-gray with a black stripe down his back. He was leading a pack that had been hitting ranches in the valley, and I was helping Jim Morrison with his cattle operation. We'd lost 6 calves in 2 weeks, and Jim was talking about selling out and moving to town. Mac's voice grew distant as he relived the memory. I tracked that wolf for 3 days, learned his patterns, figured out where he'd crossed the creek coming back from a hunt. When I had him in my scope, I remember thinking how beautiful he was, how perfectly designed for survival in country that would kill most creatures. But I pulled the trigger anyway. Derek was silent, waiting for Mac to continue. I told myself it was necessary, that I was protecting people's livelihoods, their way of life, and maybe that was true. But what I didn't expect was how empty I'd feel afterward. How the sight of his mate howling over his body would wake me up in cold sweats for months. Mac turned from the window to face Derek directly. That wolf I saved from your python? I think she was his mate, and I think she recognized me. Derek's face paled. That's impossible. Is it? You know as well as I do that wolves have incredible memories, incredible intelligence. That mother wolf looked at me like she knew exactly who I was and what I'd taken from her. But she didn't run. She didn't attack. She trusted me to save her life. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the distant sound of wind moving through the empty corral. Derek slumped into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 48 years. So what are you saying, Mac? That I should just forget about what they did to me? Pretend it doesn't matter? I'm saying that revenge is a poison that kills the person carrying it. I'm saying that those wolves are trying to survive just like you are, just like your family was, and I'm saying that if you release those other snakes, you'll become something you might not be able to live with. Derek was quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Susan won't even take my calls anymore. The kids think I'm a failure. I've got nothing left, Mac. Nothing except this anger, and if I let go of that, what's left? Mac sat back down across from Derek, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of the other man's despair. What's left is the chance to become someone your kids can be proud of again. Someone who chose mercy over revenge. Someone who broke the cycle instead of continuing it. It's too late for that. Is it? What if it's not? What if this is exactly the moment when you get to choose who you want to be for the rest of your life? Derek looked up and Mac could see tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I don't know how to be anything other than angry, Mac. The anger is all that's keeping me going. Then maybe it's time to find something else to keep you going. Something that builds instead of destroys. Outside, the first drops of rain began to spatter against the kitchen window, and Mac found himself thinking about the wolf mother and her 3 pups, hopefully safe and dry in whatever den they'd found. Somewhere in Derek's barn or storage shed, 2 more pythons waited in their containers, ready to be weapons in a war that had already claimed too many casualties. The choice of what happened next lay entirely in the hands of the broken man sitting across from him, and Mac could only hope that Derek would choose healing over revenge, forgiveness over fury, life over death. The storm that rolled across the Flathead Valley 3 days later brought with it the kind of torrential rain that could turn mountain streams into raging torrents and wash out roads that had stood for decades. Mac woke to the sound of thunder echoing off the peaks and rain hammering against his cabin windows with unusual fury. By morning, the Weather Service was issuing flash flood warnings, and the Forest Service had closed all backcountry trails. Mac's first thought was of the wolf family. Their den, wherever it might be, would need to provide protection not just from the rain, but from the potential for rapidly rising water. He'd spent enough years in these mountains to know that storms like this could be deadly for wildlife, especially young animals who hadn't yet learned to read the subtle signs that warned of nature's violent moods. He was pulling on his rain gear when his phone rang. Sarah Crow Feather's voice carried an urgency that made his stomach clench with dread. Mac, we've got a problem. Derek Whitmore never showed up for his interview yesterday, and when Fish and Wildlife went to serve the warrant this morning, his place was empty. No sign of him or the remaining snakes. Through his kitchen window, Mac could see the forest disappearing into sheets of gray rain. You think he's taken them into the woods? That's exactly what I think. And with this storm, we can't get aircraft up to search for him. If he releases those pythons during the flood, we might never find them, or the evidence we need to prosecute. Mac was already reaching for his keys. I'm going out there. Mac, absolutely not. The roads are washing out and it's dangerous as hell. We'll have to wait for the weather to clear. But Mac was thinking about golden eyes and the trust they'd shown him, about 3 small pups who depended on their mother's wisdom to keep them alive. Sarah, that wolf family is out there somewhere, and if Derek's planning what I think he's planning, waiting isn't an option. He ended the call before she could argue further and headed out into the storm. The drive to Derek's ranch took twice as long as usual, with Mac's pickup fighting through standing water and navigating around fallen trees that the wind had brought down across the road. When he finally reached the property, Derek's truck was nowhere to be seen, but Mac could make out fresh tire tracks leading toward the old logging road that wound up into the high country. The logging road was barely passable under the best conditions, and the storm had turned it into a muddy nightmare of ruts and washouts. Mac's truck slipped and slid up the mountain, his four-wheel drive working overtime to maintain traction on the treacherous surface. Twice he had to stop to move fallen branches, and once he nearly slid backward into a gully when his rear wheels lost their grip on the saturated earth. After an hour of brutal driving, Mac spotted Derek's truck parked beside a grove of aspens about 3 miles up the mountain. The vehicle sat empty, its tailgate down and 2 large wooden crates missing from the truck bed. Derek's tracks led away from the truck and deeper into the forest, toward an area Mac recognized as prime denning habitat for wolves. Mac grabbed his emergency pack and followed the tracks, the rain soaking through his jacket within minutes despite its waterproof rating. The forest around him was alive with the sound of rushing water as every creek and gully became a temporary waterfall. Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the trees in stark black and white snapshots that revealed the true fury of the storm. It took him another 40 minutes to find Derek, and when he did, the scene before him made his blood run cold. Derek stood in a small clearing beside a rock outcropping, rain streaming from his hair and clothes, holding what appeared to be a modified cattle prod in his hands. 20 feet away, 2 large wooden crates sat with their lids open, revealing the sinuous forms of the remaining pythons, each one larger than the snake Mac had encountered at the first rescue. But it was what lay between Derek and the crates that made Mac's heart stop. The wolf mother, Luna, as he'd begun thinking of her, was trapped beneath a fallen tree branch, her right hind leg pinned and her 3 pups circling frantically around her. The storm had brought down a massive limb that had struck her as she'd attempted to move her family to higher ground, and now she lay helpless as Derek approached with his makeshift weapon. "Derek, stop!" Mac shouted over the roar of the storm. Derek spun around, his face twisted with an emotion that went beyond anger into something approaching madness. "Stay back, Mac! This ends today!" "This isn't the way. Look at her. She's already hurt, already trapped. You don't need to do this." "Don't I?" Derek's voice cracked with emotion. "This is the one, Mac. This is the alpha female that led the pack that destroyed my life. I've been tracking her for months, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment." Mac edged closer, his hands raised peacefully. "How do you know she's the one?" "The white patch on her chest. I saw it that night when I found my sheep. She was standing over one of my ewes, blood on her muzzle, looking right at me like she was daring me to do something about it." The wolf mother struggled weakly against the branch that held her down, her golden eyes moving between Mac and Derek with an intelligence that was almost human in its depth. Her pups had retreated to the shelter of a nearby boulder, but Mac could see them watching their mother with the kind of desperate devotion that transcended species. "Derek, please," Mac said, taking another step forward. "Think about what you're doing. Think about the man you used to be before all this happened." "The man I used to be was weak." Derek raised the cattle prod, its electric tip crackling in the rain. "The man I used to be let animals destroy everything he'd worked for and didn't fight back." As if responding to Derek's raised voice, one of the pythons began to emerge from its crate, its massive head testing the air as it scented potential prey. The sight of the snake seemed to galvanize the trapped wolf, who renewed her struggles against the fallen branch with desperate energy. Mac realized with crystal clarity that he was looking at a moment that would define not just his own character, but Derek's as well. Everything that happened in the next few minutes would determine whether 2 broken men would choose healing or destruction, whether a mother and her children would live or die, whether the cycle of violence and revenge would continue or finally be broken. "Derek," Mac said quietly, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. "Look at her. Really look at her." Derek's grip on the cattle prod wavered slightly. "What?" "Look at how she's positioned herself. Even trapped, even hurt. She's trying to shield her pups from you. She's not thinking about attacking or defending. She's thinking about protecting her children, just like you tried to protect yours. It's not the same thing, isn't it? You've spent 3 years consumed by rage and grief, and where has it gotten you? Your family is still gone, your ranch is still failing, and now you're standing in the rain preparing to torture a mother who's just trying to keep her baby safe. Derek's face crumpled, and for a moment Mac saw past the anger to the devastated father underneath. She took everything from me, Mac. Everything. No, Derek. Anger took everything from you. Revenge took everything from you. This wolf is just trying to survive in a world that's every bit as harsh and unforgiving as the one that broke your heart. The python had emerged fully from its crate now and was moving with purposeful intent toward the trapped wolf. Its companion snake was beginning to stir as well, drawn by the scent of warm-blooded prey and the opportunity for an easy meal. Mac knew they had only moments before the situation became irreversibly tragic. "You can end this cycle right now," Mac continued, inching closer to Derek. "You can choose to be the man your children remember from before the wolves, before the anger, before the pain. You can choose mercy." Derek looked down at the cattle prod in his hands, then at the trapped wolf, then at the approaching pythons. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Derek dropped the cattle prod and ran toward the advancing pythons, using his own body to block their path to the helpless wolf. "Get away from her!" he screamed, kicking at the nearest snake with his heavy work boots. Mac sprinted to the fallen branch and threw his full weight against it, feeling it shift slightly under the combined pressure of his efforts and the wolf's renewed struggles. "Come on!" he grunted, and miraculously Derek appeared beside him, adding his strength to the effort. Together they lifted the branch just enough for Luna to pull her injured leg free. She scrambled away from the fallen timber and limped quickly toward her pups, who rushed to meet her with joyful whimpers and relieved nuzzling. The pythons, confused by the sudden activity and the presence of multiple humans, began to retreat toward the shelter of the trees. Derek stood watching them go, his chest heaving with exertion and emotion. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Mac looked at the wolf family, now reunited and moving carefully toward the safety of deeper forest. Luna paused at the edge of the clearing and turned back one final time, her golden eyes meeting Mac's with what could only be described as gratitude, before she disappeared into the storm with her children. "Now," Mac said, "we figure out how to heal." The call came at 3 in the morning, 2 weeks after the storm. Mac jolted awake to the shrill ring of his landline, his heart immediately racing with the kind of dread that had become familiar since Ellen's cancer diagnosis years earlier. Middle-of-the-night phone calls never brought good news. "Mac?" Maggie's voice was strained, barely controlled. "You need to get to the hospital. It's Derek." Mac was pulling on his clothes before she finished the sentence. "What happened?" "Sarah found him in his truck at the bottom of Miller's Creek Ravine. He's alive, but—" Maggie's voice broke. "Mac, they think he did it on purpose." The drive to Kalispell Regional Medical Center passed in a blur of empty highways and racing thoughts. Mac's mind kept circling back to their last conversation in the clearing, to the moment when Derek had chosen to save Luna instead of destroying her. Had that choice not been enough to pull Derek back from whatever dark precipice he'd been approaching? Had Mac somehow failed him by not recognizing how close to the edge the other man had been? The hospital's emergency department buzzed with the controlled chaos that Maggie knew so well from her nursing years. She met Mac in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn, still wearing the clothes she'd thrown on when Sarah's call had awakened her. "How bad?" Mac asked without preamble. "Broken ribs, concussion, internal bleeding?" Dr. Patterson says he'll live, but Mac—" Maggie lowered her voice. "The truck went through the guardrail at the worst possible spot. If the pine trees hadn't stopped his descent, he would have gone all the way to the bottom. It's a miracle he survived." Sarah Crow. Feather appeared from the direction of the treatment rooms, her uniform rumpled and her expression grim. As a Fish and Wildlife officer, she'd seen her share of accidents involving people who spent their lives in dangerous country. But this was different. This felt personal. "He was conscious when we pulled him out," Sarah reported quietly. "Kept saying he was sorry that he couldn't do it anymore. The truck smells like alcohol, Mac. He'd been drinking heavily before he went off that road." Mac sank into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed to be standard issue in hospital waiting rooms everywhere. "Any word from his family?" "Susan won't come," Maggie said gently. "I called her myself. She said—" Maggie hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. "She said Derek made his choices and she has to protect her children now. She's filing for divorce." The words hit Mac like a physical blow. He understood Susan's position. She'd watched Derek spiral into darkness for 3 years, had tried to hold their family together while he consumed himself with rage and revenge. She had her own children to think about, her own survival to ensure. But the finality of it, the way it would crush what remained of Derek's spirit, made Mac feel sick. "Can I see him?" Sarah shook her head. "He's in surgery. Dr. Patterson is repairing a tear in his spleen. It'll be hours before we know if he's stable enough for visitors." The waiting began then, the kind of helpless vigil that had become all too familiar to Mac during Ellen's final months. Hospital coffee that tasted like burnt water, fluorescent lights that made everyone look corpse pale, the constant background hum of medical equipment and hurried conversations that spoke of life and death decisions being made behind closed doors. Dr. Patterson emerged from surgery just after dawn, his scrubs stained with blood and his expression cautiously optimistic. "He's stable," he announced without preamble. "The spleen repair went well and there's no sign of brain swelling from the concussion. He was lucky, incredibly lucky." "When can we see him?" Mac asked. "He's awake, but sedated for pain management. I can allow one visitor for a few minutes, but keep it brief. He needs rest more than conversation right now." Mac found Derek in a private room overlooking the hospital's small garden, his face a map of bruises and abrasions, his left arm in a cast and his torso wrapped in bandages that spoke of the surgical intervention he'd undergone. Machines beeped softly around the bed, monitoring vital signs that had come too close to flatline for comfort. Derek's eyes were open when Mac entered, but they held a dullness that had nothing to do with pain medication. When he saw Mac, tears began to leak from the corners of his eyes, running down his bruised cheeks in silent streams. "I'm sorry," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so damn sorry, Mac." Mac pulled the room's single chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. "What were you thinking, Derek?" "I wasn't thinking. That's the problem. I stopped thinking weeks ago. Maybe months ago." Derek tried to shift position and winced at the movement. "After what happened in the woods, after I helped save that wolf, I thought maybe I could find a way back to being human again. But when I got home and looked around at what my life had become, I realized it was too late." "It's never too late to change course." Derek's laugh was bitter and broken. "My wife won't speak to me. My children think I'm a monster. I've got no money, no prospects, no reason to keep going. The only thing I was good at was raising sheep, and the wolves took that away from me." Mac was quiet for a long moment, studying Derek's battered face and thinking about the conversation they'd had in Derek's kitchen just days earlier. There was something Derek had said that had bothered Mac at the time, something that didn't align with what Mac knew about wolf behavior. "Derek," Mac said slowly, Tell me again about the night you found your sheep dead." Derek's eyes closed, and Mac could see him reliving the trauma. "I told you, 50 sheep, throats torn out, scattered across 3 acres. The wolves didn't even eat most of them, just killed for sport. And you saw the alpha female that night? The one with the white chest patch? Clear as day. She was standing over one of my breeding ewes, blood on her muzzle, looking right at me like she owned the place." Mac leaned forward in his chair. "Derek, wolves don't kill for sport. They kill what they can eat, and they typically drag their kills to a central location to feed the pack. What you're describing, it doesn't match normal predation patterns." Derek opened his eyes, confusion replacing some of the despair in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe the wolves weren't the only predators on your ranch that night. Maybe they were scavenging from kills that something else had made." The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Derek stared at Mac with growing comprehension, and Mac could see the moment when a terrible possibility began to take shape in the other man's mind. "The python," Derek whispered. "Jesus Christ, Mac. What if the python I bought wasn't the first one? What if someone else was already using them to kill livestock and make it look like wolf attacks?" Mac felt his stomach drop as the implications hit him. If Derek was right, if someone had been deliberately framing wolves for livestock kills, then Derek's entire 3-year descent into madness had been based on a lie. His marriage, his ranch, his sanity, all destroyed by a deception that had turned him into the very weapon being used against the wolves he'd blamed for his losses. The question now was, who would benefit from such an elaborate and cruel deception? And how many other ranchers like Derek had become unwitting pawns in someone else's war against the wolves? The investigation that followed Derek's revelation moved with the kind of methodical precision that Mac had come to associate with Sarah Crowfeather's approach to wildlife law enforcement. Within 48 hours of Derek's hospital confession, a joint task force involving Montana Fish and Wildlife, the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit, and the State Veterinarian's Office had descended on the Flathead Valley like a scientific army, armed with forensic equipment and a determination to uncover the truth behind what was beginning to look like an elaborate conspiracy. Dr. Patricia Hensley, the state veterinarian, arrived from Helena with a team of forensic specialists and immediately requested access to Derek's ranch records, including photographs from the night his sheep had been killed. What she found contradicted everything that Derek and the initial investigation had concluded about the attack. "These wound patterns are all wrong for wolf predation, Doctor," Hensley explained to Mac, Derek, Sarah, and FBI Special Agent Robert Martinez during a meeting in Derek's hospital room. She spread crime scene photographs across Derek's bedside table, pointing to details that had been overlooked 3 years earlier. Wolves kill with precision. They target the throat or nose to bring down prey quickly and efficiently. What we see here suggests constriction injuries consistent with snake predation, followed by post-mortem tearing that could easily be mistaken for wolf attacks. Derek stared at the photographs with growing horror, his face pale despite the pain medication. So, the wolves were just cleaning up. Exactly. Wolves are opportunistic scavengers. They'll feed on carrion when it's available, which would explain why your alpha female was standing over a dead sheep with blood on her muzzle. She wasn't the killer. She was taking advantage of an easy meal. Agent Martinez, a compact man in his 50s with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of investigating environmental crimes, leaned forward in his chair. "The question is, who benefits from framing wolves for livestock kills? In our experience, these kinds of operations usually have a financial motive." The answer came from an unexpected source. Tom Brennigan, a neighboring rancher who'd heard about the investigation through the valley's efficient gossip network, arrived at the hospital that afternoon with information that would crack the case wide open. "I should have spoken up years ago," Tom admitted, his weathered hands twisting the brim of his hat as he stood awkwardly in Derek's hospital room. "But I was scared, and I didn't want to believe what I was seeing." Tom had been driving home from a poker game in Kalispell 3 years earlier when he'd spotted unusual activity on the consolidated agribusiness land that bordered Derek's ranch. Consolidated was a massive corporate farming operation that had been buying up small ranches throughout the valley, often at below-market prices when family operations failed due to predation losses or economic pressure. "I saw trucks with cages in the back," Tom continued. "Big wooden crates like the kind they used to transport livestock, but these had air holes drilled in them. And the men handling them weren't dressed like ranchers. They looked more like, I don't know, scientists or something." Agent Martinez was taking notes rapidly. "Did you recognize any of the vehicles or personnel?" "The trucks had Consolidated logos on the sides, and I'm pretty sure I saw Dr. Vincent Crawford directing the operation." Mac felt his blood run cold at the mention of Crawford's name. Dr. Vincent Crawford was Consolidated's chief veterinarian and head of their predator management program, a position that gave him access to ranchers throughout the valley and detailed knowledge of livestock operations, predation patterns, and wolf behavior. Sarah was already on her phone calling for warrants to search Crawford's property and Consolidated's facilities. But Agent Martinez raised a hand to stop her. "We need to be careful here," he warned. "If Crawford is running an operation this sophisticated, he'll have contingency plans. We move too fast and evidence disappears." Dr. Hensley was studying her photographs with renewed interest. "If Crawford has been using exotic snakes to kill livestock and frame wolves, he'd need a source for the animals, facilities to house them, and a distribution network to place them strategically. This isn't a one-man operation." The scope of the conspiracy became clearer over the next several days as the investigation expanded. Financial records subpoenaed from Consolidated showed a pattern of land acquisitions that correlated directly with reported wolf attacks. In every case, the company had approached struggling ranchers within months of devastating predation events, offering to buy their land at prices that allowed families to escape bankruptcy but left them with little to start over elsewhere. Crawford's personal finances revealed regular payments from Consolidated that far exceeded his veterinary salary, along with mysterious consulting fees from a Florida-based company called Exotic Wildlife Solutions. When agents raided the Florida facility, they found extensive records of python sales to buyers throughout the western United States, all coordinated through Crawford's recommendations. But it was the discovery at Crawford's personal property that provided the smoking gun the investigators needed. Hidden in a climate-controlled outbuilding behind his house, agents found a sophisticated snake breeding and housing facility containing over 40 Burmese pythons in various stages of maturity. Computer records showed a detailed database tracking the placement of snakes at specific ranches, timed to coincide with seasonal patterns that would make wolf predation appear most likely. The cruelest aspect of Crawford's scheme was its psychological sophistication. He hadn't simply been killing livestock and framing wolves, he'd been systematically identifying ranchers who were already struggling financially, then using fabricated predation events to push them over the edge into bankruptcy and despair. Derek's case was just one of dozens across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, where small ranching operations had failed following suspicious livestock losses that had never been properly investigated. When agents arrested Crawford at his veterinary clinic, they found him calmly destroying computer files that contained the names and locations of ranchers who were scheduled to be targeted in the coming months. Among the planned victims was Mac's neighbor, a young couple named Jake and Maria Santos, who had recently started a small organic beef operation with their life savings. The interrogation of Dr. Crawford revealed a man whose environmental ideology had become so twisted that he genuinely believed he was saving the wolves by destroying the ranchers who opposed them. In his mind, forcing small operations out of business and consolidating land under corporate control was a necessary step toward creating large-scale wildlife preserves where wolves could thrive without human interference. Small ranchers are the real enemy of conservation, Crawford told Agent Martinez during his confession. They cling to outdated practices and refuse to coexist with predators. Consolidated has the resources to implement proper predator management while maintaining profitable operations. I was simply accelerating a process that was inevitable anyway. When Derek learned the full scope of Crawford's manipulation, his reaction was a mixture of rage and heartbreak that left him physically shaking in his hospital bed. "He destroyed my family," Derek whispered, tears streaming down his bruised face. "He destroyed my marriage, turned me into a monster, made me hate creatures that were innocent of everything I blamed them for." Mac sat beside Derek's bed, watching his friend, for that's what Derek had become, grapple with the knowledge that his 3-year descent into madness had been orchestrated by someone he'd trusted, someone who had presented himself as an ally in the fight against predation losses. "What do I do now, Mac?" Derek asked. "How do I live with what I've become? How do I face my children knowing that I tried to torture innocent animals because I was too stupid to see I was being manipulated?" Mac was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his own journey from guilt to redemption, about the golden eyes that had looked at him with forgiveness instead of hatred. "You start by forgiving yourself, Derek, and then you figure out how to make amends. Susan will never take me back. The kids, maybe not. But that doesn't mean you can't become the man they remember from before all this happened. That doesn't mean you can't find a way to honor their memory of who you used to be." Outside Derek's hospital window, the autumn sun was setting behind the peaks of Glacier National Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Mac of Luna's eyes. Somewhere in those mountains, the wolf family was preparing for winter, teaching the pups to hunt and survive in a world that was dangerous enough without the additional threat of human hatred and manipulation. The truth had set Derek free from the lie that had consumed him, but freedom came with its own burden of responsibility. Now he would have to choose what to do with the rest of his life, how to transform his guilt and rage into something that could heal rather than destroy. And Mac realized that his own journey was far from over. Saving Luna from the python had been just the beginning. The real work of redemption lay in helping Derek find his way back to the light, in protecting other ranchers from Crawford's deception, and in building bridges between the human and animal communities that shared this magnificent and unforgiving landscape. 6 months after Dr. Crawford's arrest, Mac stood on his cabin porch watching the sunrise paint the peaks of Glacier National Park in shades of rose and gold. The coffee in his hands was still steaming, but for the first time since Ellen's death, the silence around him felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Somewhere in the forest below, Luna and her family were beginning their day, and the knowledge that they were safe brought him a contentment he hadn't felt in years. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Derek's recovery, both physical and emotional, had been a slow and often painful process that required patience from everyone involved. When he was finally released from the hospital, Derek had nowhere to go. His ranch was in foreclosure, and the revelation of Crawford's conspiracy had come too late to save his marriage or his relationship with his children. That's when Maggie had made a suggestion that surprised everyone, including herself. "He can stay in Robert's workshop," she'd announced over coffee one morning, referring to the converted garage where her late husband had pursued his woodworking hobby. "It's got a bed, a bathroom, and a kitchenette. He needs time to figure out what comes next, and we all need to keep an eye on him." Mac had been skeptical at first. Derek was still struggling with depression and guilt, still prone to dark moods that worried everyone who cared about him. But Maggie's nursing instincts had proven sound. Having Derek nearby had given them both a project, a way to channel their own grief and loneliness into helping someone else heal. Derek's transformation began with small acts of service. As his physical injuries healed, he started maintaining Maggie's garden, repairing the fence that deer had damaged, and splitting firewood for both their homes. The physical labor seemed to ground him, giving him a way to process his emotions through honest work that produced visible results. But it was his involvement with the wolf monitoring program that truly began to restore Derek's sense of purpose. Sarah Crowfeather had established a volunteer program to track the valley's wolf populations, documenting their movements and ensuring that other predation events were properly investigated. Derek's intimate knowledge of ranching practices and livestock behavior made him an invaluable asset to the program. "I know what genuine wolf sign looks like now," Derek explained to Mac one evening as they reviewed trail camera footage on Mac's laptop. "I know the difference between a real predation event and Crawford's fabricated attacks. If I can help other ranchers avoid what happened to me, maybe some good can come from all this." The legal proceedings against Crawford and Consolidated Agribusiness had moved through the courts with the kind of methodical precision that characterized high-profile environmental crimes. Crawford received a 15-year federal sentence for conspiracy, fraud, and violations of the Endangered Species Act. Consolidated faced millions in fines and was required to establish a restoration fund for ranchers who had been victimized by the scheme. Derek's case became a centerpiece of the prosecution's argument, demonstrating how Crawford's manipulation had destroyed families and communities while endangering protected wildlife. Derek's testimony, delivered with the kind of raw honesty that only comes from having survived genuine trauma, helped secure convictions against 12 other individuals involved in the conspiracy. The financial settlement Derek received from Consolidated wouldn't make him wealthy, but it was enough to start over. Instead of trying to resurrect his ranching operation, Derek had made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He enrolled in a wildlife biology program at the University of Montana, determined to become the kind of advocate for coexistence that Crawford had pretended to be. "I spent 3 years hating wolves for something they didn't do," Derek told the local newspaper in an interview that was picked up by national media. "I figure I owe them at least that much time trying to protect them." Mac's own relationship with Luna's pack had evolved into something that bordered on the miraculous. The wolves had established a territory that included his cabin, and Luna seemed to have claimed him as an honorary member of her extended family. She would appear at the edge of his property several times a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with her pups, always maintaining a respectful distance but clearly keeping watch over the human who had saved her life. The pups, now nearly adult wolves themselves, had inherited their mother's unusual comfort around Mac. They would play in the meadow below his cabin while Luna rested in the shade, their antics providing entertainment that was better than any television program. Mac had learned to recognize each pup's individual personality. Storm, the largest and most adventurous, Shadow, the cautious one who always stayed close to Luna, and Hope, the smallest but most curious, who would sometimes venture closer to Mac's porch than her siblings dared. Dr. Sarah Morrison, a wolf behavior specialist from the University of Montana, had begun studying Luna's pack as part of a research project on human-wolf interactions. Her findings were revolutionizing scientific understanding of wolf intelligence and adaptability. "Luna's behavior is unprecedented in the literature," Dr. Morrison explained during one of her visits to Mac's cabin. "She's demonstrating cognitive flexibility and emotional intelligence that suggests wolves may be capable of more complex relationships with humans than we previously understood." Her decision to trust Mac, despite the fact that he killed her mate, represents a level of forgiveness and pragmatic thinking that challenges our assumptions about wild animal behavior. The research had attracted international attention, with documentary filmmakers and wildlife photographers arriving from around the world to capture footage of the remarkable bond between Mac and Luna's family. Mac had initially resisted the attention, but Maggie convinced him that sharing the story could help change public perceptions about wolves and promote better coexistence practices. The economic impact of the wolf tourism had been transformative for the valley. Local businesses reported increases in revenue of up to 40% as visitors came to experience what was being called the Montana Miracle. Hotels, restaurants, and guide services were booming, providing employment for former ranchers like Derek, who were transitioning to new careers in wildlife tourism and conservation. Tom Brennigan, the rancher whose testimony had helped expose Crawford's conspiracy, had converted part of his operation to what he called predator-friendly ranching, using guardian dogs and improved fencing to protect his livestock while allowing wolves to traverse his land. His success had inspired other ranchers to adopt similar practices, creating wildlife corridors that benefited the entire ecosystem. The community healing hadn't been without its challenges. Some longtime residents resented the changes, feeling that their traditional way of life was being sacrificed for the benefit of outsiders and wild animals. Town hall meetings could still become heated affairs when the subject of wolf management arose, and there were those who blamed Mac for bringing unwanted attention to their quiet valley. But for every critic, there seemed to be two supporters who recognized that the community's future lay in finding ways to coexist with the natural world rather than fighting against it. Children in the local schools were learning about wolf ecology and conservation, and a new generation was growing up with a different understanding of what it meant to be a good neighbor to wild creatures. As autumn approached, Mac found himself thinking often about Ellen and how she would have reacted to everything that had transpired. He could imagine her delight in watching the wolf pups play, her satisfaction in seeing Derek's transformation, her pride in the community's evolution toward greater compassion and understanding. "She would have loved this," he told Maggie one evening as they sat on his porch watching Luna and her family drink from the stream below. Ellen always believed that love was the most powerful force in the world, that it could heal any wound and bridge any divide. Maggie reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of a relationship that had deepened from friendship into something more profound. "Maybe that's her legacy," Maggie suggested quietly. "Maybe all of this happened because she taught you how to love unconditionally, even when it's difficult." As if summoned by their conversation, Luna appeared at the edge of the meadow, her golden eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. She looked directly at Mac for a long moment, and he could swear he saw something like gratitude in her gaze before she melted back into the forest with the silent grace that made wolves seem like creatures of magic rather than flesh and blood. Mac squeezed Maggie's hand and felt his heart fill with a peace that had eluded him for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose compassion over conflict, understanding over fear. But tonight, surrounded by the people and creatures he had learned to love, Mac finally understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing its pain. It was about transforming that pain into something beautiful, something that could nurture life rather than destroy it. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, and somewhere in the distance, Luna's howl echoed across the valley. Not a cry of mourning or defiance, but a song of gratitude that seemed to bless the darkness with hope. Message to American seniors, 55 to 68. Sometimes life breaks us in ways we never expected. Loss of a spouse, estrangement from children, or mistakes that haunt our sleepiest hours. Mac's story reminds us that it's never too late to find redemption, even when we've lost everything that once defined us. At 58, widowed and drowning in guilt, Mac discovered that the very creature he'd wronged became his path to healing. Luna's forgiveness taught him that love transcends species, that mercy is stronger than revenge, and that sometimes our greatest wounds become our greatest teachers. Derek's transformation from broken rancher to wildlife protector proves that rock bottom can be a foundation for rebuilding. Like many of us approaching our golden years, these men learned that purpose isn't found in what we've lost, but in what we choose to do with our remaining time. Their story whispers hope to anyone who's ever wondered if their best days are behind them. They're not. Second chances don't have expiration dates, and forgiveness, both giving and receiving it, remains our most powerful tool for healing. What moment in your life taught you the power of forgiveness? Have you ever experienced an unexpected friendship that changed your perspective on what's possible? Share your story below. Your wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, when the aspens had turned the mountainsides into tapestries of gold, and the first dusting of snow crowned the highest peaks. Mac had never imagined he would marry again, had never thought his heart could expand beyond the love he'd shared with Ellen. But Maggie had taught him that love wasn't a finite resource. It was more like a candle lighting another candle, doubling the light instead of diminishing it. The ceremony was held in the meadow below Mac's cabin, the same place where Luna's pups had played through the summer months. Maggie wore a simple blue dress that brought out the silver in her hair, and Mac had traded his usual flannel for a suit that Derek had helped him pick out during a rare shopping expedition to Kalispell. The guest list was small but meaningful. Sarah Crowfeather and her family, Dr. Morrison and several colleagues from the university, Tom Brennigan and his wife, and a handful of neighbors who had supported them through the difficult months of investigation and healing. Derek served as Mac's best man, a role that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Standing beside the altar that Tom Brennigan had built from fallen timber, Derek looked like a different person than the broken man Mac had found in the hospital. His face had filled out, his eyes had regained their spark, and his smile carried the kind of genuine happiness that comes from finding purpose after profound loss. The minister, Pastor Williams from the community church in town, had agreed to perform the ceremony outdoors despite the unconventional setting. He was a practical man who understood that some unions were blessed by creation itself, and he'd been moved by the story of how Mac and Maggie's love had grown from shared grief into something that strengthened them both. Marriage isn't just about two people finding happiness, Pastor Williams told the small gathering. It's about two souls choosing to build something together that's larger than either could create alone. Mac and Maggie have already proven that their union serves a purpose greater than themselves. They've helped heal wounds, protect wildlife, and bring their community together in ways that honor both human and natural relationships. As the pastor spoke, Mac found his eyes drawn to the forest edge where Luna appeared, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She stood perfectly still among the aspen trees, her golden eyes watching the proceedings with what could only be described as benevolent approval. The sight of her brought tears to Mac's eyes, and he felt Ellen's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, blessing this new chapter of his life. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, written by Mac and Maggie themselves during long evenings of conversation about what they wanted their marriage to represent. Mac promised to honor Maggie's independence while offering his complete devotion, to support her dreams while sharing his own, and to never take for granted the miracle of finding love twice in one lifetime. Maggie's vows brought tears to every eye present. Mac, you taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means transforming pain into purpose, loss into love, regret into renewal. I promise to walk beside you through whatever seasons remain to us, to celebrate the wolf family that brought us together, and to never stop believing in the power of second chances." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed not only by their human guests, but by Luna and two of her pups, who had emerged from the forest to observe the ceremony. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This union was blessed by both civilization and wilderness, by human love and natural acceptance. The reception was held on Maggie's back patio, with food contributed by every guest and music provided by Tom Brennigan's Bluegrass Band. Derek surprised everyone by giving a speech that reduced half the gathering to tears and the other half to laughter. "A year ago, I was the angriest, most broken man in Montana," Derek began, his voice steady and clear. "I blamed wolves for destroying my life, and I was preparing to commit acts of cruelty that would have made me a monster. Mac and Maggie didn't just save Luna that day in the forest. They saved me from becoming something I couldn't have lived with. They showed me that forgiveness is possible, that healing is possible, and that love really can conquer hate." Derek raised his glass of sparkling cider. He'd given up alcohol as part of his recovery process and looked directly at the newlyweds. "Mac, you killed Luna's mate, but you chose to save Luna's life. Luna had every reason to hate you, but she chose trust instead. Today, we celebrate not just your marriage, but the miracle of forgiveness that makes all our relationships possible. To Mac and Maggie, may your love inspire others the way it's inspired me." As evening approached and the guests began to disperse, Mac and Maggie walked hand in hand to the edge of their property where the forest met the meadow. The autumn air carried the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of winter, but also the warmth of wood smoke from their neighbors' chimneys and the lingering fragrance of Maggie's garden. Luna appeared one final time that day, emerging from the shadows with all three of her now adult pups flanking her. The wolf family arranged themselves in a line at the forest edge, as if posing for a formal portrait to commemorate the occasion. Luna's golden eyes met Mac's across the meadow, and in that gaze he saw everything that mattered: forgiveness, acceptance, the endless possibility of love to heal even the deepest wounds. "She's saying goodbye," Maggie whispered, her hand tightening in Mac's. Mac nodded, understanding instinctively that this was a moment of transition. Luna's pups were old enough now to establish their own territories, and the pack would soon disperse as nature intended. The remarkable bond between human and wolf had served its purpose. Mac had found redemption, Derek had found healing, and the community had learned new ways to coexist with the wild creatures that shared their mountain home. "Thank you," Mac called softly across the meadow, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. Luna tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging his words, then turned and led her family into the deepening shadows of the forest. They moved with the fluid grace that made wolves seem like creatures of legend rather than flesh and blood, disappearing so completely that Mac might have thought he'd imagined them, if not for the perfect line of paw prints they left in the soft earth. Standing there with Maggie's hand warm in his, Mac felt the last of his guilt and grief finally release their hold on his heart. Ellen's love had taught him how to love. Luna's forgiveness had taught him how to forgive himself, and Maggie's companionship had taught him that joy could bloom again, even in hearts that had known profound loss. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant points of light in the clear mountain air. Somewhere in the forest, Luna's pack was beginning a new chapter of their lives, just as Mac and Maggie were beginning theirs. The future stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainty but also infinite possibility, blessed by the knowledge that love, between humans, between species, between all living things, remained the most powerful force in the universe. As they walked back toward their home, Mac heard it one last time. Luna's howl echoing across the valley, carried on the night wind like a benediction. It was a song of gratitude, of farewell, of hope for all the tomorrows yet to come.